afternoon. My name is Richard McCormick, and I'm here today as part of the History Day Organizing Committee. I'm also with the James Ranger Civil War Museum and the Campbell County Historical Society. And thank you guys for coming out. Right now I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, and it is certainly a pleasure. I've heard him speak before, and he does a very good job, so no pressure. But Don Rightmyer is a staff librarian at the Mercer County Public Library in Harrisburg, not far from one of my favorite places, Perryville, speaking of the Civil War. He was editor of the Kentucky Ancestors, which is the Kentucky Historical Society Genealogical Quarterly from 2008 to 2013, and he's been a loyal speaker at the History Day since 2008. And so it's going, as you can see, torn between North and South, the Civil War in Kentucky. And once again, let's give a welcome for Don Rightmyer.
Well, it's a real honor for me to be invited to come back again this year, and it's actually kind of shocking to me that I have been up here every year since 2008. I guess time flies when you're having fun, right, to use a cliche. Let me give you just a little bit of background to this talk. I've been a lifelong lover of the history of the Civil War. One of the early gifts that I remember, my dad was a dentist in Harrisburg, and he would go annually to the Kentucky Dental Convention. He brought me back a children's version of the American Heritage History of the Civil War. I still have that book today. I actually found another one a year or two ago, but it was just, I love the Civil War, but I will tell you that as a lifelong student of the Civil War, when I went to the Air Force Academy, went there from 69 to 73 and majored in military history, I think finally it opened my eyes to the tragedy of what the Civil War meant to this country. I don't know if any of you have seen the statistics. For years and years we said that the country lost about 500,000 men during that war. In recent years someone has re-evaluated the numbers, and they believe that we may have lost as many as 600 to 750,000 men during the war. Well, I'm a native of Harrisburg, or that's where I grew up. I live in Danville now. And as was mentioned, I used to work at the Kentucky Historical Society for 7 years, and now I'm working at the Mercer County Library there in my hometown of Harrisburg. Now, the genesis of this talk actually is based on a little book that was published in 1976. This is a book by Dr. Lowell Harrison, who you may be very familiar with. It's a little 106-page monograph. It was in what they call the Bicentennial Bookshelf series. It was a small format that allowed them to publish a lot of books, UK Press, on different topics of Kentucky history. And many years ago, more than I wish to tell you, I actually decided that that book was not adequate to us to understand the Civil War. So do not let me forget to show you at the end. I actually have a book coming out that's entitled the same thing as my talk. It's called Torn, the Civil War in Kentucky. And it's not physically in print yet. It's supposed to be in print in June. But anyway, I want to share this story with you because I believe, and I've had no one that's argued with me to the contrary, that Kentucky has one of the most unique experiences of any state in the United States during the Civil War. And you may want to take issue with me when you see the talk. Let's go ahead and launch into it. We'll try to wrap up by 1 o'clock, and I will leave time for questions at the end. I started working at the Kentucky Historical Society in April of 2007, and during the course of my 7 years there, I was actually surprised to find some of the myths that still exist about Kentucky and the Civil War. So I designed this talk to address some of those myths straight up front. If you believe any of these things that are on this slide, then I hope to set you correct in the actual facts of what this state experienced. So let's just look at them. Note, these are not true statements. So please, you know how sometimes you'll hear something and then you forget the context that, well, someone was quoting something. First of all, I can't tell how many people I heard that said Kentucky seceded from the Union. That is not a true statement. It did not happen. And I will address that a little bit later. Yeah, they did have a flag, a star on the Confederate flag, and obviously Kentucky was represented on the flag of the United States. But it did not secede from the Union. Second of all, I've actually had people call me up and ask me when I worked at the Historical Society and say, I understand Kentucky did not provide any troops to either army during the Civil War. That is not a true statement, and I'll address that in a little bit. Thirdly, that Kentucky remained neutral throughout the entire war. That's not a true statement. And we'll talk about that. In fact, it did remain neutral from May through September of 1861 only. In May, the governor actually publicly announced, as we'll talk about, that Kentucky was neutral. It would not provide any men or supplies to either side, stay off of Kentucky's territory. In September, that ended. Another thing is believed by a lot of people is that Eastern Kentucky was totally pro-Union. That is not true. There were a lot of very avid and very hard-fighting men in Eastern Kentucky that were fighting on the side of the Confederacy. And finally, that Kentucky was evenly divided between North and South, and I definitely think that that would not be a true statement. Well, if we talk about Kentucky's experience during the Civil War, of course, the sort of the culmination of the national crisis that led to the Civil War really came to a height in November of 1860 when the national election for president was held. And I don't know how much you're familiar with those that ran for president, but basically I summarize here that there were 4: John Bell of Tennessee, John C. Breckinridge, who was a native Kentuckian and had been the vice president under John C. Breckinridge, of course Abraham Lincoln, who was a native son of Kentucky, born at Hodgensville, and Stephen Douglas, who was a U.S. Senator from Illinois. And if you're familiar with the story, you know that the Democratic candidates were split because of the split in the Democratic Party due to the pro-North, pro-South sentiment. So there were actually 4 men that were running for president. Now, interestingly, President Abraham Lincoln was not on the ballots in the southern states, yet he still gained enough of the electoral votes that he was elected president in November of 1860. The state of Kentucky predominantly voted for John Bell. And one of the obvious reasons is because the platform of the Constitutional Union Party was to preserve the Union. That was a big deal. And that was part of his platform. It's very interesting to note that the state of Kentucky sent a stone to be placed on the Washington Monument, specifically from this state, that said, if the Union should ever dissolve, Kentucky will be the last state to leave it. That's actually a stone that is engraved and in the Washington Monument. So one of the things that we have to remember is that there was obviously a very strong sentiment within Kentucky that the Union should not be dissolved by anyone taking themselves out or anything along those lines. And as I point out here, both Abraham Lincoln and John C. Breckinridge were native sons of Kentucky. I also like to make a very quick, interesting aside. A couple years ago, I did a talk about Major Robert Anderson, who was the commander at Fort Sumter. Robert Anderson was a native Kentuckian, born in Jefferson County. Abraham Lincoln, as I mentioned, was born in LaRue County. And the president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, was born down just southwest of present-day Bowling Green. So I always said that the fight at Fort Sumter was a fight between 3 Kentuckians: Anderson, Davis, and Lincoln. One of the issues that really confused things as far as the Civil War and certainly Kentucky's position was the belief that if you were a slave-owning state, you would obviously join the Confederacy. A lot of the southern states that readily left the Union from South Carolina in December of 1860 through several other states that left in early 1861 were very confused as to why Kentucky didn't readily also pass a legislation taking themselves out of the Union. Another thing you'll find that's very unique about Kentucky, and I didn't really address this on those untruths, was that if you asked a lot of people, if you were a Confederate during the Civil War, what would be your beliefs about slavery? And most people would say, well, you would be pro-slavery and fighting in defense of it. And if you were a Union person, you would be against slavery and fighting to get rid of it. Well, as I could point out to you, one of Abraham Lincoln's closest friends and strongest Union supporters here in Kentucky was Dr. Robert J. Breckinridge, who had been a superintendent of public instruction for Kentucky. And he was adamantly opposed to the end of slavery in Kentucky. I mentioned in the last session in the Underground Railroad, we were talking about how we deal with things and sometimes we don't. I don't know how many of you know that the state of Kentucky did not ratify the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, until 1976. That's not a typo. And I will say to you, and I'm not bad-mouthing Kentucky public education, but I didn't learn that in school. I learned that when I started really digging into the facts and the research for this book that I did. But the state of Kentucky decided that by the time we celebrate our bicentennial, it might be a good idea if we also ratified the 13th Amendment. Supposedly, there's only one state that's not ratified the 13th Amendment. I'm not going to tell you which one that is, but they claim the paperwork just didn't ever show up. Anyway, one of the states of the Union still has not ratified that amendment. We talked a minute ago about secession and how that affected Kentucky. In January of 1861, it was very clear that this national crisis was about to really break out. The governor at that time was a guy by the name of Brian McGoffin. He was from Mercer County, Harrodsburg. Actually, from the 5th grade on, I lived in a house that was in the shadow of McGoffin's home there in Harrodsburg, and it's still there today. It's called Clay Hill on Beaumont Avenue, if you've ever been there. He believed that things should be done according to proper procedure and legal methods. Now, you can compare him to Governor Isham Harris of Tennessee, who absolutely believed that Tennessee ought to join the Confederacy, and so he just basically made that happen. Well, McGoffin didn't believe in that, so he called a special session of the Kentucky legislature, and his hope was that they would maybe call a sovereignty convention and they would actually decide whether or not Kentucky would remain in the Union or whether it would leave it. Well, that sovereignty convention never happened. I actually heard someone a few years ago refer to the great debate in the Kentucky legislature about secession. Well, that debate never occurred. There was some talk, but it never came to anything formal like that. After the fall of Fort Sumter, on April 15, 1861, the Secretary of War sent a letter out to all of those states that had not seceded and requested that they would raise men and money for the war. Kentucky received a request for 4 regiments of men, and I'll try to quote as best I can what Governor McGoffin wrote back. He said, "In reply, I will tell you that Kentucky will not provide any men for the purpose of subduing her sister southern states." End of statement. I'll keep that in mind because I'm going to tell you what Kentucky did end up doing by the time the war was over. Because the governor at that time said, we're not going to do it, and the end result was something radically different. There were a lot of people that had 2 different views. Some wanted Kentucky to secede, some didn't. A lot of people thinking, okay, maybe if we can wait long enough, we'll get one side or the other to go our way. So that was when the idea of neutrality came about. And as we mentioned a minute ago, the concept of neutrality was that Kentucky would say, do not come on our soil, and we're not going to support either side. Finally, in May of 1861, that did occur, and then that actually ended in September when Confederate forces actually came onto Kentucky soil at Columbus, which is a city that sits on the eastern bank of the Mississippi River in the far end of this state. Well, those that were not happy with the fact that Kentucky had decided that they would support the Union, a lot of those folks met down in Logan County, Russellville, Kentucky, and they actually created what they call the Provisional Government of Kentucky. Very shortly after that, in December, representatives were sent to the Confederate Congress, which had been created by that point, and that's when Kentucky was accepted into the Confederacy, and a star was actually placed on the Confederate flag that represented Kentucky. But the state itself never seceded from the Union, and as I said, it's one of the few states, and I believe Missouri was the other, that was actually represented on the flag of both the Confederacy and of the United States of America during the Civil War. Let me show you just very quickly by using this map why both sides really wanted Kentucky to be on their side during the Civil War. If you look at the map, you would know, if you know anything at all about the geography and the borders of Kentucky, you know that from where the Ohio River comes down to that northeastern corner, from there all the way to the Mississippi, that is the northern border of Kentucky. And at that time, there were virtually almost no ways of crossing the Ohio River by bridge, other than one that was actually erected here between northern Kentucky and Cincinnati during the war. So just by virtue of the Ohio River, if it was running at its regular height, would be a significant geographical obstacle to any army trying to move either direction. If you know anything about eastern Kentucky, you know that it's not exactly a picnic getting from Virginia or Tennessee into Kentucky. Remember, Daniel Boone had to come in by way of the Cumberland Gap. If you're talking about bringing armies in, that's a rather significant obstacle to you. Down to the south, you've got the state of Tennessee, which early on did, in about the middle of 1861, join the Confederacy. And you've got Missouri that's wavering between joining the Confederacy or remaining in the Union. Another thing that I'm sure we're very proud of, whether you're a native Kentuckian or not, is the fact that Kentucky has always been a very significant agricultural state. And we all know that good food grows in Kentucky. Well, that was true back in the 1860s. Hemp was one of the big products in Kentucky prior to the Civil War. It was used quite a lot in the roping that they needed to bag up the cotton of the South. It also was used for making rope for the use by the U.S. Navy. Two of the other significant kinds of contributions that Kentucky was considered to be available to make was that of horseflesh. Obviously, we're very proud of the heritage we have in good horses, but what I find particularly interesting was the amount and quality of the mules. You need some horses that are not necessarily fast afoot, that can pull wagons and artillery pieces and things of that sort. So Kentucky, potentially, both sides saw it as being a real resource for that. And talk that I gave last night that I mentioned to you earlier about Kentucky's fighting men is the fact that Kentucky has a long and, I think, really a military heritage it can be proud of. A lot of the Kentucky men fought in the Mexican War. A lot of those would fight again during the Civil War, such as John Hunt Morgan and other men like him. A lot of Kentucky men had fought during the War of 1812. Kentucky actually suffered the highest percentage of casualties during the War of 1812. And so the military heritage of Kentucky had begun from the very early pioneer days, and I'm assuming that both sides knew that if they could get men from Kentucky, that would be a significant addition to their military forces. So there was a variety of geographical and also natural resources reasons why Kentucky was sought very adamantly by both sides. Remembering again, Abraham Lincoln was a native son of Kentucky. He had moved to Indiana, then he had moved on to Illinois, and of course had served as a member of the Congress from Illinois, and that's where he was from when he was running against Stephen Douglas for the Senate seat from Illinois. He at one point even made the quote, "I too am a Kentuckian." And he was very conflicted about the fact that Kentucky was a slave-holding state and some of the things that he was considering possibly doing as the war progressed. And so a lot of his actions were based on that. Well, after September 1861, when Confederate forces came in to Columbus down here on the far western border of Kentucky, the state legislature then officially said Kentucky will stay with the Union, will support the Union, and they actually demanded that Confederate forces be removed from Kentucky, which did not happen. And eventually, by the late part of 1861, early 1862, you'll notice that dashed line. That would kind of portray the initial sort of break between the control of the Union on the northern side of Kentucky and the control of Confederate forces on the southern side. You'll notice that when they had the meeting at Russellville in Logan County, that sits just west of Bowling Green there, and of course, makes sense. That was sitting within the Confederate defensive lines at that time, since they were meeting to discuss they hoped the secession of Kentucky and, of course, the creation of that provisional government of Kentucky. One of the things that had happened in August of 1860, before the end of neutrality and secession, was some of the elections that were held in the state. The president had actually called for special session of Congress, and elections were prompted by that. There was also other elections in August, and as a result, all of the legislative people that went from Kentucky to the U.S. Congress were pro-Union, except for the gentleman that was from the farmost western part of Kentucky. In fact, he actually was elected to his seat in the Congress, and then he quickly, within just a matter of a few weeks, resigned and then became actually a member of the Confederate Congress. One of the things that this showed was that there was a very strong pro-Union sentiment within Kentucky. One of the other things that I've always wondered about is when you have an election, if you decide in protest that you're not going to vote, how do you think the election is going to turn out? Well, those that wanted Kentucky to secede decided not to vote in those elections, so of course those elections are going to go against you. I mean, that doesn't take a rocket science to figure that out, and that's sort of what happened. Very quickly into the Civil War, particularly in Kentucky, one of the things that was unfortunate that began to happen was the arrest and imprisonment of civilians. Robert Anderson, the commander at Fort Sumter, had quickly been made a brigadier general after he had gained national notice from his position that he'd been at Fort Sumter, and he was made a brigadier general and placed over military affairs in Kentucky. And it irked him, and he actually was on record as trying to cut down on the number of people that were actually... What would happen was, as you find in any kind of a civil war, people who had hard feelings against a neighbor or someone else in the community, they'd gin up an accusation that this person was pro-Confederate, and the next thing you know, they'd been arrested, they'd been shipped across the Ohio River. Some of them were actually in prison up in Baltimore, in one of the forts up there. So let me just quickly name some of these people, the important, noted politicians, important people. One of them was Reuben Durrett, who was one of the early beginners of the Filson Club, which was the historical, continues today, is known as the Filson Historical Society in Louisville, but he was arrested on the suspicion of disloyalty. A former governor, Governor Moorhead, was actually arrested and in prison for a short period of time before he was released. And a lot of less well-known citizens, some of Henry Clay's descendants actually were suspected or perhaps were even pro-Confederate, and some of them actually went to Canada to get away from the possibility of being arrested. But this is some of the kind of things that were going on in Kentucky, and you can imagine if you place yourself back in that time frame, what it would be like to be living in the state and not know if somebody's going to, turn you in, whether it was based on truth or not, that you were in fact perhaps considered disloyal to the United States government. Let me just summarize very quickly. There were about over 300 different battles, actions, and skirmishes that occurred in Kentucky during the Civil War. Now, these are the basic large battles that occurred, and I'm just quickly going to discuss those with you, and then I'll just show you one map in a minute and very quickly give you an overview of what happened at the Battle of Perryville, which was the largest and most bloody battle in Kentucky. A lot of these actions of the plus 300 that I mentioned were cavalry actions or actions from cavalry against guerrillas, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But one of the first significant battles on 19 January of 1862 was a fight near Somerset, actually just west of there, a place that is referred to by different names, but one of those is Mill Springs. The commander was General George H. Thomas, who was a native Virginian, a West Pointer, and he had definitely never even, I think, considered going to the Confederacy when the war began. It's very interesting to note that when he decided that he would stay with the Federal Army, he had two sisters in Virginia. When they learned of his decision, they turned his photo to the wall and said that they did not have a brother after that time for the rest of their lives. He was the Union commander at the Battle of Mill Springs. Felix Zollicoffer was a former politician and newspaper editor from Tennessee. He was actually a native Tennessean, even though his name is descended from Germany in that area, Zollicoffer. General Zollicoffer was actually killed in the battle, and when he'd been killed, the things were turning against the Confederate forces and the Confederate troops fled the battlefield. This was one of the first, if you will, significant Union victories of a battle during the Civil War. Another one in 1862 was a result of what's referred to as the Confederate invasion of Kentucky in 1862. There were basically two Confederate armies that came into Kentucky. One came in and around Cumberland Gap, and that was under the command of General Edmund Kirby Smith. The other Confederate army was the Army of the Mississippi, or later known as the Army of Tennessee, which came up through Glasgow, Kentucky, in about the center part of the state, and they basically moved up into central Kentucky. Well, Edmund Kirby Smith encountered a Union army around Richmond down in Madison County. A large number of those Union soldiers had literally just been recruited and trained. Some of them hadn't even actually fired their guns. It was a disastrous defeat for the Union Army. I think it's probably the largest surrender of Union troops throughout the entire Civil War. And then Edmund Kirby Smith moved on into Lexington, and they occupied Lexington. The other army under Braxton Bragg, who was a native North Carolinian, he came on up. He had a small action. Both General Anderson and General W.T. Sherman in command of military operations in Kentucky. So he was the commander of the Army of the Ohio, the main Union army here in Kentucky. And I'll show you what happened at the Battle of Perryville in just a moment. I've got a map, and I'll try to give you a feel for what occurred there. And as I mentioned, I will mention that Perryville was the bloodiest and the largest loss of life in Kentucky. It started at 2 o'clock on the afternoon of October 8, 1862. It lasted up until about sundown, and by the end of the battle, there were over 7,000 casualties between dead and wounded. This occurred near the little town of Perryville, which had about 300 people. And if you've not seen or read the book called Perryville Under Fire by Stuart Sanders, I would recommend that to you. It's a history press book, and it's an amazing story about what it's like, what it was like during the Civil War for a little town in Royal County, Kentucky, to suddenly find themselves inundated by over 7,000 casualties as a result of a very bloody battle. Another two actions occurred at Cynthiana and Harrison County, and those were primarily battles between Union troops and the mounted men of John Hunt Morgan. I'm going to talk about Morgan a little bit more in just a minute. As I said, there were, basically 300 and something other actions, but those were all smaller in size than these, which were more on the size of a major battle. This is a map that I'll try to just give you a feel for what occurred at the Battle of Perryville. As you can see, if you notice there, Perryville on the right corner of the map, there's several different roads coming into Perryville, which made it a very strategic location as far as the control of central Kentucky. The Confederate forces under General Braxton Bragg had basically been located in Harrodsburg in Mercer County, which would sit up here to the far right, upper right corner of the map. You'll see the map, if you can read that, you probably can't, it says to Harrodsburg. That's the direction the Confederate Army came in. The Union Army came in from 3 different directions. They had left out of Louisville. The Union Army was composed of 3 corps. Each of those corps were about 20,000 men. And the basic fighting in the Battle of Perryville occurred up on the upper left-hand corner of this map. That was the 1st Corps. It was under General Alexander McDowell McCook. The 3rd Corps was in the center, and the 2nd Corps was on the right. Those 2 corps, by and large, were not involved in the Battle of Perryville at all. And there's a lot of reasons and mysteries behind why that happened. One of the things that occurred was General Don Carlos Buell had had a horse fall on him a day or so before the battle. And he was actually sitting in his headquarters house, which would be off to the left side of that map. So I don't know whether he was totally out of it or what. It's really kind of an unanswered mystery. But basically, throughout the day of October 8th, when the fighting began, he did not realize that there was a battle going on. I live in Danville now, and the prevailing direction of the wind at Perryville goes from the southwest, or the lower left-hand corner of that map, up to the upper right. As you know, the direction the wind blows makes a difference on if you can hear sound. So it's very likely, because of the hilly terrain, if you've not been to Perryville, let me just tell you, it's amazing to see where the men fought and the hills and the valleys that they had to go over. But it's very likely that because of the terrain and the wind direction, and also something that's known as acoustic shadow, that General Buell was not able to hear the battle. One of his messengers actually left Buell's house, and when he got to a certain point, he said it was like a curtain had been pulled back. And all of a sudden, he could hear this tremendous sound of this battle that was taking place on the upper left-hand corner of that. Well, in a nutshell, what happened was the fact that because he did not know that his army was engaged in this major battle, 2 corps, those bottom 2 corps, were never engaged. The Confederate Army consisted of about 18,000 men, and the upper left-hand corps of the Union Army contained about that same number of men. And through the course of the fighting during the day, the Confederate Army actually was able to push back that upper corps until the point where they really had gone as far as they could go. The sun fell, darkness fell upon the territory, and as I said, there were about 7,000 casualties suffered by both sides. During the night, General Braxton Bragg was told by his subordinate commanders that there were actually 2 more corps of Union Army out there that had not been engaged. So during the night, the Confederate Army withdrew, went back to Harrisburg. When the Union Army woke up the next morning, the Confederates were gone. And General Buell was severely criticized after the battle for not ardently following that army. As I said, both sides had taken, the Union Army actually suffered more casualties than the Confederate, but between them about 7,000 casualties. So eventually, the Confederate Army departed the state within just a matter of a few days to a week or so. And that was basically the essence of the Battle of Perryville. But it was the largest, as far as Kentucky, it was certainly one of the largest. And Stuart Sanders, who used to be my carpool buddy, and I think he finally convinced me that it was also one of the most hotly fought battles of the Civil War, even though when you compare it to many other battles, such as Gettysburg and different ones like that, the number of casualties are greater. But in the period of hours, there's no question that this was a very hotly fought battle. It's also in October, it was extremely dry, and the temperatures were extremely hot. So that's just a nutshell. I would encourage you to go visit Perryville. The first week in October is their annual reenactment, and they have talks and interpretive tours and things of that sort, so you can get a little better feel for the landscape and what happened there. Let me briefly tell you about the governors of Kentucky. These would be those that were actually elected to the government of Kentucky. The first one, as I mentioned, was Governor Goffin. He had been elected in 1859. He absolutely was pro-slavery, saw nothing with slavery at all, and made no bones about that in public statements and speeches that he gave. He actually resigned from office in August of 1862. There was, as I mentioned, because of the elections, a very predominantly pro-union legislature. Basically, everything he would try to do, they would counter, or if they passed a law, he would veto it, and then they would override the veto. There's strong belief that he may have gotten some death threats. Anyway, August of 1862, just before that big invasion by the Confederate Army, he resigned. And James F. Robinson, a member of the legislature, was made the governor. He basically took over just a matter of days before that large invasion. The legislature actually moved to Louisville because of the fear, and it turns out that when the Confederates came in, they occupied Frankfort, and the capital, which is still there today, the old state capital, was the only Union capital of a state that was occupied by Confederate forces during the Civil War. They only remained there a few days. In fact, they elected a governor and were going to have a large inaugural ball, and during the course of the afternoon, they heard the Union cannon of cavalry and troops had been sent, so they decided to cancel the ball and leave town. The third governor actually had been a former Union officer. He was actually a full colonel in the Union Army, Thomas Bramlett, and he served actually a full term. Robinson actually filled out McGoffin's term, and then Bramlett was elected, and he served a full term, which carried him through the end of the Civil War. The provisional government, as I mentioned, that had been created down in Bowling Green, or actually in Russellville, west of Bowling Green. When they created that government, they actually elected a provisional governor. The first one's name was George Johnson. He was a native of Scott County, and he actually, during the Battle of Shiloh, he was down in that area because once the Union Army had taken control of Kentucky, the provisional government moved out of the state, and they pretty much stayed with the Army of the Mississippi, or then later known as the Army of Tennessee, wherever they were. So at the Battle of Shiloh, Johnson took up a rifle of an instrument and was killed in battle there at the Battle of Shiloh. He was replaced, newly elected by the inner circle of the provisional government by Richard Hawes, and he served throughout the remainder of the Civil War as the provisional governor. There's really not been a whole lot of research. I've thought about doing some research and writing that up. I think it's a very interesting topic, but there was some function, but really they didn't have a lot of control. Kentucky was predominantly in the control of the federal government throughout most of the war, except for that invasion period during 1862. One of the things that's very interesting, and I think very unique about Kentucky, is the role or the belief it had in slavery. And as the war progressed, the federal government particularly saw that there might be an advantage to enrolling African American men into the Union Army. And so they wanted to proceed to try to start what they call registering them. Well, when they raised that issue with the government of Kentucky and the governor, they ran into a lot of opposition. As I mentioned, Dr. Robert J. Breckinridge was adamantly opposed to anything involving the abolition of slavery. A lot of people in the state were very scared at the idea of actually putting African American men in uniform and giving them a gun. They thought that was going to lead to a lot of violence. And it was only in March and April of 1864 that Kentucky, that the enrollment and the mustering in and training of African American soldiers actually began. And the place that most of this happened, one of the largest camps, of course, was Camp Dick Robinson, which is, Camp Nelson, which is located over in Jessamine County, just southeast of Fayette County, where Lexington is. And I think it's very interesting to note here, again, remembering that some of this type of recruiting of black men was occurring in a lot of places before March and April of 1864. But notice that Kentucky had 23,703 men that were actually enlisted in Kentucky. Now, some would say, yeah, they weren't all from Kentucky. They probably came in from Tennessee or other places. They escaped their masters. That may well be true. One of the things that did happen was if you joined the Union Army as an enslaved black man, then you got your freedom. And so that was obviously a big incentive. Louisiana, which had been pretty much in control of the federal government from early days of the Civil War, is actually the state that raised the largest. And I actually had a co-worker when I worked at the Kentucky Historical Society who said he believed he could document that there were probably 400 more, which would make us #1 if he could produce that evidence. But as I pointed out, Camp Nelson was named after the first commander of Camp Dick Robinson, General William Nelson. And it was one of the largest. The USCT stands for United States Colored Troops. That was what they referred to them as. If you were in the Confederate or the Colored Cavalry, you were referred to as United States Colored Cavalry, and if you were in the artillery, it was the United States Colored Artillery. But the predominant term would be USCT, which meant the African American men that were serving in the Federal Army. Well, 1864 brought around another presidential election. You know, they do that every 4 years. And so it was time to have the country vote again for who would be the president. You probably remember, or you may not, but the Democratic candidate that was running was the former General of the Armies, General George McClellan. And he was on the Democratic ticket, and President Abraham Lincoln was obviously running on the Republican ticket. And this was the outcome of that vote. All of the states were carried by President Lincoln except for Delaware, New Jersey, and Kentucky. Kentucky voted for General McClellan. It was interesting, I failed to mention this in the election of 1860. You know that Mrs. Mary Todd Lincoln was from Fayette County, but Abraham Lincoln only got 4 votes in Fayette County in the 1860 election. That's kind of interesting. I think he got a few more in 1864 from Fayette County. One of the people that most folks have heard of or know about is John Hunt Morgan. He was a Confederate general during the Civil War. He was not a native Kentuckian, although we'll claim him. He was brought here as a child. He grew up and he served in the Mexican War. He'd been had a pretty significant role in the Kentucky State Guard, which we would know today as the Kentucky National Guard. He actually had a company of the Kentucky State Guard there in Fayette County, and it was very interesting. How many of you heard of Crab Orchard over in Lincoln County? Crab Orchard's a small community, but back in that day, it was one of those sort of medical resorts where you would go and take the waters, as they called it. And John Hunt Morgan would actually take his Kentucky State Guard Company over there, and they would do drill as entertainment. So, you know, they obviously didn't have television, internet. You know, they were entertained by his, but his guys were pretty sharp and pretty well dressed. Well, during the Civil War, John Hunt Morgan quickly went to the South. He had obviously spent a lot of his early life riding horses, and he basically led and trained and equipped men that were horse-mounted infantry. A lot of people think he was cavalry. They really were not. What Morgan would do was use his men on horse to get them to the action, and then they would dismount. They would have horse handlers, and they would either, you know, engage the other force in battle with their rifles or whatever. They didn't do a lot of what we might consider cavalry. They really were not. They were basically mounted infantry. As you may know, he was killed in Greenville, Tennessee by Union soldiers close to the end of the Civil War. One of the things that's very interesting about Kentucky with that strong Unionist legislature was early on in the war, they passed laws, the Unionist legislators did, that were basically punishing to those that left the state to join the Confederacy. One of the things that they passed the law, it said, is if you got killed in the war as a Confederate soldier, your body could not be returned to Kentucky for burial. So John Hunt Morgan was killed down in Tennessee. His body was taken to Richmond, Virginia. He was buried there, and then in the post-Civil War years, if you've been to Lexington, you know there's a large equestrian statue of John Hunt Morgan. His body was brought, and he's actually buried in his family plot there in the Lexington Cemetery. General Roger Hanson was killed in the late part of 1862, early 63 at the Battle of Stones River. His body was taken to Nashville, Tennessee, and then he was brought back and buried in Lexington Cemetery as well after the war was over. Guerrilla warfare was something that was very prevalent in Kentucky. It was so prevalent that it became to the notice of President Lincoln, and he actually, you know, relayed a message to the Secretary of War to go see what was going on in Kentucky. Basically, as I point out here, there were a wide mix of people that we would probably consider as guerrillas. Some of them were very, perhaps, remotely connected to the U.S. or to the Confederate Army as far as their actions and operations, and some of them were very clearly not connected to the Confederate Army at all. In fact, some of the guys who survived the war actually are big names that you will hear in the Wild West following the Civil War. The Younger brothers and folks like that were actually guerrillas during the Civil War. William Quantrell had actually been out in the Missouri, Kansas, you know, the bloody times that went on before the Civil War. Apparently things got too hot for him. He came to Kentucky and then was subsequently run aground. He was killed. Champ Ferguson and Sue Mundy were both guerrillas, and they were both actually, Champ Ferguson was actually captured after the war, tried and executed for his crimes during the war. But I often, as I've worked on this book that I've got coming out, thought about the state of Kentucky and the fact that you have a lot of these men that had left home, and you know, oftentimes you actually can read accounts of families, and when they would hear the thundering of hoofbeats down the road, they wondered what was coming. They wondered, was it a cavalry unit or was it guerrillas coming? What was going to happen? And there's some very interesting stories that you find during the Civil War that deal with that. Well, what was the cost of the war to Kentucky? Remember I said that the Governor Goffin said that Kentucky would not provide any men or resources to this war that was beginning. Well, in truth, the state of Kentucky provided about 100,000 men to the Union Army, about 40,000 men to the Confederate Army. As you can see here, about 28% of the men who served from Kentucky died. About 10,000 of them died as a result of battle, wounds, or actually killed in a battle. About 20,000 died from either disease or exposure. Exposure being severe weather conditions and just, being wet and getting ill and things of that sort. Obviously, there was a large impact on Kentucky. As I mentioned, these resources of mules, horses, of grain crops, these things were taken out of Kentucky on a large basis and made a real impact on the agricultural basis of Kentucky. And certainly with the ending of slavery, slaves had been a very large part of the economy of Kentucky. A lot of the slaves in Kentucky were actually used in a somewhat different function than they were in many of the deep south states. Many of them actually sort of knew trades and would be hired out as carpenters and different occupations of that sort. And the end result, as we'll talk about just a minute before I wrap up, was the sort of the attitude of Kentucky in general towards the federal government. And it was not good. Here's some truths. Let me get up here where I can read this that I do want to highlight. I showed you some untruths at the beginning. I want to highlight these truths. Kentucky was only neutral from May through September of 1861. It did provide a large number of men to both the armies of the North and South that we just mentioned. It was eagerly sought by both the Union and the Confederacy. It contributed over 79 general officers. There were actually 42 general officers in the Union Army and 38 in the Confederate Army. And as I pointed out, Kentucky provided a large quantity of mules, horses, and food to the war effort. In the post-war years, very quickly, if you had served during the Mexican War and you were a veteran, that was considered quite a plus for you if you ran for political office. Well, the Unions, we know, won the Civil War. The Confederacy did not. You might think that that would have been a positive that you had served in the Union Army. It was not. And as the Confederate veterans and those that had been strong Confederate supporters returned to Kentucky or were in the post-war years, very quickly they found that many of these former Confederate veterans and Confederate supporters were elected to the legislature, and they quickly began to turn around a lot of the laws that had been passed against those that had gone to the Confederate Army. If you'll note here, these are three former Confederates or very strong Confederate supporters that were elected governor of Kentucky after the war. General Simon Bolivar Buckner was a West Pointer. He had been instrumental in the reorganization of the Kentucky State Guard in the pre-Civil War years, served as Confederate general, and was elected the governor of Kentucky in the latter part of the 1800s. Let me jump down to the last one. James B. McCreary was a lieutenant colonel in the Confederate cavalry, and he was also elected governor of Kentucky. Dr. Luke Blackburn was a pro-Confederate supporter and actually is known and tried to send tainted clothing with disease to northern cities to hopefully spread disease to those cities. But all three of those pro-Confederate fellows actually were elected governor of Kentucky in the post-Civil War years. They, as I pointed out, I didn't give you a reading list for this today, but there are basically three books that are in print today that are a good summary, will touch on the overall topic that we've talked about. The early one by Merck Coulter came out in the early 1900s, 1926, and it's pretty heavy-duty academic history, but it was actually the first sort of overall history of Kentucky in the Civil War. This little book, the one I just showed you, by Lowell Harrison, is, at this point, probably the best thing as far, and it's actually still in print. I think the University Press of Kentucky's done about 4 or 5 editions, but it's unchanged. It just has a different cover. If you've seen the New History of Kentucky that was done by Dr. Harrison and Dr. Clotter several years ago, it has an outstanding chapter on the war in Kentucky, and it has an excellent bibliographic essay. And then I mentioned to you that I've got this book that's coming out hopefully this June, and I don't have any with me today. I don't even have a copy, but I'll just show you there quick. I'm going to put it back up. That's what it looks like. designed to show the division of Kentucky between the North and South. If you have any questions, if you're like me, you will think of some things that you want to ask me about tomorrow, and you and I won't be here. There's my address. It's actually donrightmyer.yahoo.com, where I created this new one in sort of promotion support of my book, civilwarkentucky@gmail.com. But if you have a question, and I'll take some questions here. We've got just a little bit of time, and I'm going to put that up. Question? Yes, sir.
About how close did Kentucky come to joining the Confederacy? And
Okay.
number two, did you ever hear a figure on how many horses and mules were killed in the Civil War?
I've not heard a story on the mules and horses, but I know that there was a significant taking of the horse flesh from Kentucky, no question about it. In fact, one of the things, because we, even back in those days, had these farms that raised high-quality horses, when the armies would go through, they would make use of those horses. A lot of these farms that had horses lost them. He asked me a question before this thing, and I'll try to answer it. Is how close did Kentucky come to going to the Confederacy? I would say it did not come very close. As I said, Governor McGoffin was not in support of taking Kentucky out of the Union unless the legislature voted to do that. That did not occur. That vote never happened. That meeting never occurred. Probably the closest would be the fact that they created that provisional government. That was the ones that wanted Kentucky to succeed, and when it didn't, then they, created that provisional government. Some would claim that if you notice the things I mentioned about Confederate veterans and they're being able to get elected into the legislature and that kind of thing, that Kentucky did not succeed until after the war was over. So you can make your own judgment on that. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was wondering I was told by somebody from Lewis County that Lewis County is the only county in Kentucky that has, on public grounds, a Union memorial.
I believe that's true. I think virtually all the memorials to the Civil War that are in Kentucky are in honor of Confederate veterans. I believe that's true. And I, if you'll send me an email, I got some resources, I'll dig that out. Yes, sir.
It's somewhat true.
Okay.
When I visited Perryville battlefield, there's this huge monument. And I walked up to it, it's a Confederate monument. Yeah.
And it's from the state of Ohio, right? Well, there's, yeah.
But next to it, there's a smaller federal monument.
There is one, there is one. There's the one inside which is actually a mass grave there at Perryville. It's a Confederate monument, and right outside there's one from Ohio. Yep. You're right. And I think the other one's true. Yes, sir.
A statistical question. Since Kentucky's contributing troops to both sides, is a percentage of their population, a percentage of men eligible to fight? Did their participation in the war, was it about the same as other states, more or less?
It was less than a few of the states, but it was more than a lot of them.
Okay.
And I can't give you a statistic, but if you send me an email, I'll try to dig that up for you. His question was, how did Kentucky's contribution of men relate to the percentage of the population? And I think I've seen some things on that, but because I'm a proud Kentuckian, I'm always looking for Kentucky to be number one. Basketball or whatever. But I would try and dig that up for you. But I do believe from what I saw that we're not, we didn't contribute the most, the highest percentage, but I think we were up there. And I will tell you, let me just make one other quick comment. There was a variety of reasons, particularly that the guys joined the Union Army. And the obvious one initially was the preservation of the Union. The other one, which became a real problem for some of them, was when the Emancipation Proclamation was going to be put in effect. Some of those men tried to get out of the Army because they were like, I fought to preserve the Union, I did not fight to end slavery. But again, that goes back to this dichotomy in Kentucky about if you're pro-Union, pro-Confederate, does that mean you're pro-slavery or not? And that may have been true in a lot of places, but in Kentucky, that's a mixed bag. So. Yes, sir.
The guerrilla activities that happen in the state, is that also included in the 300 battles and skirmishes?
Yeah, some of those are actually in the Confederate. There's a multi-volume Confederate military history that was done after the war, and that's where I've actually seen the most complete listing of actions. And as I remember, some of those are like Union troops against guerrillas or home guard against guerrillas.
Okay.
So some of those things were, not to make. There's one fellow that I think is on that Damien. I don't know if his name's Damien Beach on the reading list. He makes the point that it doesn't make a difference if there's 20,000 guys or 10 guys, if you're the one that gets killed by a bullet, it's an important battle.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very valid point. So, but yeah, some of those were far smaller actions. And we find some of those mentioned in the official records of the rebellion that the War Department put out after the Civil War. Some of them, actually, are asterisked as the no documentation. So, one of the things that I think is sort of sad, and I did a talk last night down in Richmond on the Kentucky's fighting in the Civil War. When the state was neutral, it was not allowed to have any kind of recruiting camp or anything in Kentucky, but when that ended, then there were all kinds. And I can document 160 forts and camps that existed during the Civil War, but unfortunately, it's my expectation a lot of those have not been marked, interpreted. Some have, like Camp Dick Robinson, Camp Nelson. There's obviously places up here in northern Kentucky, but there are a lot of places, and I actually have a list. If anybody's interested, if you'll email me, I can send you a list of those 160, and it tells you the name of it, what county or city it's located in, and which side had it. Some of them were used by both, but a lot of those, unfortunately, and I'm still a working slob. You know, I work full-time there at Mercer County Library, but I would love to go around. I think it would be a very interesting book to put together to just document where those places were. A lot of them, quite frankly, probably you would have a hard time identifying today, but it's possible that can be done. Yes, sir.
I've researched the cemeteries and things, and I found a lot of colored troops, Spanish American War stuff and stuff together. My question is this: I see field worker reports, and I'm not sure if you know, do they come out doing those hands-on themselves? I mean, like the Veterans Administration, whatever it was back at that point.
And are you talking about right after the Civil War?
Yeah, I guess. Would they come out and do those, or do those?
Well, let me tell you how the national cemeteries came about very quickly. Dr. Drew Gilpin-Faust, who's an academic historian, I think she's president of Harvard College, or Harvard University. Anyway, she wrote this book several years ago, which I recommend, but she wrote a very interesting chapter. She talks about how our national cemeteries came into effect. What they realized was as the war was drawing to a close, that there were guys buried all over this country where battles had occurred, and that as soon as the war was over, the farmers were going to start plowing these fields. So the federal government, I don't know how they did it, but in a matter of a period of months, sent out teams to find these remains, and if possible, dig them up and then relocate them. And that's when the birth of a lot of these national cemeteries came about. So what occurred, and I found this interesting, she actually describes how the African American laborers that were with them, they noticed that when they were finding someone that was distinctively Union, they were digging him up. When they found one that was distinctively Confederate, they weren't touching him. And they said, what's going on here? That happened at the Battle of Perryville. But anyway, I think that actually, I really don't know the exact answer to your question, but it's a very good question. As we mentioned Perryville, after the Battle of Perryville, the Confederate Army had left the battlefield. The Union Army gathered their dead. They buried them initially in and around their regimental campsites, then they were subsequently moved over to Camp Nelson, and that's where you'll find many of them today. Unfortunately, a lot of the names that were identified were lost. Many of those men are unfortunately buried as unknown. But the Union Army would not pick up the Confederate dead. They claimed a couple of things. One, they weren't going to, they had very strong sentiments against burying these rebels. And the other was that there had been some reports of Confederate soldiers robbing the bodies of dead Union. So actually what happened was a gentleman by the name of Squire Henry P. Bottoms, who owned much of the land on which the Battle of Perryville was fought, was told to take his people and get these bodies. And his people, of course, was reference to the slaves that he owned. And they went out and gathered these Confederate dead, and they are buried there, which we were mentioning a minute ago, in this mass grave that today has a stone fence around it and has a Confederate monument on it. And but anyway, that's a good question. But I didn't know that story about the national cemeteries, but it made good sense because when the war was over, a lot of these folks, particularly in the South, were hurting, and they were going to start plowing these fields, and these basically sacred ground where these soldiers had been buried was going to be desecrated. So they gathered them up and put them in national